there, welcome to part 2 of episode 5. If you're just joining us, this is a series where I'm showcasing some of the basic building blocks that you can use to create a very simple Godot 2D platformer game. This is a beginner series and we're not creating the next AAA blockbuster game here. It's more about playing with all the tools that are available to us and getting to see them in action in an oversimplified but practical way. If you've missed previous episodes, be sure to check out our development playlist on the channel. In the last part of episode 5, we took our first good look at Godot's tile maps and tileset editor, and we added simple lighting, shadows, and sounds to our game map. Now we're going to bump it up a notch and add interactivity to the game world. We'll do this by adding the concept of player triggers into our level scene. By the end, we'll be able to create and duplicate many types of triggers and place them onto our level scene. We'll have some that add interactive switches for the player to toggle, some that show text pop-ups and hint messages for the player, some that open locked gates, and several that give the player awesome items and powerful upgrades that can be picked up. Let's get started. Here are the type of player triggers that we designed so far. We'll look at each one in more detail later in the video. Before we look at examples for each of these, let's talk about what a player trigger is, how they work, and the attributes that define them. A player trigger is our way of identifying designated points on the game map where the player can trigger an event or some sort of special action. First, this makes it easy for us to move triggers around on the map during our level design. The purpose of each trigger can range from mundane and repeatable triggers like a simple shop sign trigger in an RPG that a player can activate to read the name of a shop, to one-time item pickup triggers that give players new powers and abilities in the game. All of these triggers extend the Area 2D node that defines where the trigger is on the map. Each trigger has two primary components, the sprite 2D to display on the game world, and the collision shape that will execute the logic for the trigger. Whatever logic that might be depends on the type of trigger. More on that in a moment. Some trigger types also have additional components, such as extra sounds, text panels, and Node 2D nodes. We'll see those when we get to the trigger types that use them. Another important note is that most triggers fall into one of two main categories. Either they are item pickup triggers, where the player will receive a one-time buff or a permanent upgrade like an item, or they're not related to collectible items and instead add more interesting things to encounter in the map. Okay, let's look at some of the trigger types and what they do. We'll start with the basic prompt trigger. Using this trigger allows us to pop up text messages for the player. Useful for area names, titles, signs, tips, and other quick pop-ups. This trigger and several like it contain an additional node that holds a UI panel and a text label that will be displayed to the player. Next up is the heart item pickup trigger. Bet you can't guess what this does. There's nothing special about this trigger other than that it's a pickup style trigger, and it'll only activate one time when the player collides with it. We can duplicate and place as many of these heart pickups as we want. We have 2 on the map right now. The third trigger type is a toggle trigger. This works very similar to the prompt trigger in that it has a panel and a label that'll be displayed to the player. However, this trigger does not activate until the player presses a button on the gamepad. We also have this trigger connected to a signal that will turn a light on and off in the map when the player presses that button. The next trigger type is the boots item pickup trigger. Like the heart upgrade, this trigger deactivates once it's used once. However, in this case, instead of healing health points, the player is awarded with the speed boots upgrade. When the player has this upgrade, they can use a button on the gamepad to sprint much faster than the normal walk speed. This will give the player the ability to traverse areas more easily and make longer jumps to access previously inaccessible areas. Now let's look at the portal trigger type. As the name suggests, this trigger teleports the player somewhere else on the map. We have 2 of them on the demo map. Each one has a Node 2D node that determines where the player will go when they use the gamepad to activate the portal. They also have a text pop-up component, and will only activate when the player activates them, much like the toggle trigger. The lock and key trigger types allow us to create a secret passage on the map. This is an example of multiple triggers coming together to create a more complex interaction. The player must first obtain the key by activating the key item pickup trigger. When the player uses that key at the lock trigger, it'll open up a secret passage on the map, allowing them to explore deeper into the game. The lock trigger is also an example of a trigger that is accompanied by a sound effect. This audio is played when the secret wall is opened. The next 2 trigger types are upgrade pickup triggers, and much like the boots, they will permanently upgrade the abilities of the player. With the shield trigger, the player will pick up a shield upgrade. This immediately sets their health to 10, making them much more durable. And the pistol trigger, as you might have guessed, gives the player the pistol upgrade. Once equipped, the player can use the gamepad to fire their pistol. We'll see some more details on that weapon and its projectiles in the next episode. And finally, the last trigger type is the star trigger. This is the end goal of our simple demo game. When the player reaches this trigger, the game ends and they are presented with their final score, the time it took to reach the princess at the star at the end of the map. Now that we know what each trigger does, we can add them to our game map and move them around as desired. Now let's look at some of the logic and code that handles the player triggers. All triggers share the same underlying code that manages how the triggers are initialized and how they are activated. The triggers rely heavily on Godot's signals to communicate data, from the trigger back up to the level scene. This code in the level script is responsible for initializing all of the connections so that they'll execute the correct logic depending on the type of trigger. Each trigger in the level is assigned a script that controls how that specific type of trigger behaves in the game. To assist with connecting so many signals, we use a simple array mapping in the level script. The initPlayerTriggers function will connect the signals to the level. Most trigger types will emit at least one signal that we'll listen for and handle in the level script. Several of the more complex trigger types use more than one signal, but overall the concept is the same. We're connecting the signals from each of those trigger instances found on our map to the functions in our level script. In some triggers, we'll also keep track of when the player enters or leaves the trigger area. And in other triggers, we'll give the player a permanent item or upgrade when they collide with the trigger. And yet, in other triggers, we'll wait for the player to interact first before we perform some action. By being creative and mixing these concepts together, we can create some fun interactions in our game and give the player a sense of agency. It also makes it easier to add new triggers and trigger types to the level scene, since the main plumbing is already hooked up. And that covers how we use player triggers in our level scene. We can add multiple layers of interaction for the player, from simple text pop-ups to giving them health and items, and upgrades that give them new weapons and movement abilities. In the final episode of the series, we'll throw out some ideas on brand new trigger types that you could add to the demo, like new items and upgrades for the player to interact with. But before we get there, we're going to finish up episode 5 with one more video coming soon. Watch out for that video where we'll add hazards, moving enemies, and the basic combat mechanics to the demo game. And finally, we'll close out this episode with a scripted boss battle to give the player a finale. If you're enjoying this series and finding it helpful, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue creating valuable content. And if you stuck around this long and happen to be developing a Godot game that you want us to showcase on the channel, send us a comment. We'd love to share some of your first games and game dev experiences with our audience. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.